Hello everyone. Welcome to the 18th Brown-Beck Seminar of the Center for Diplomatic History Studies. I am Jo Yang-hyun, the director of the center in charge of today's proceedings. Thank you for your coming. Most of the meetings in our institute, directly or indirectly, focus on the policy-oriented debate or proposals, but this seminar is different. It is an arena for scholars in the field of diplomatic history to share their thought freely without aiming to make specific policy recommendations. Today, we will proceed in the order of presentation, a designated discussion, and open discussion. The former part of the seminar, that is the presentation and the designated discussion, will be recorded. This record in the format of video might be uploaded on our website with the consent of the participants. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Soeya Yoshihide is a professor of Faculty of Law at Keio University. He received his bachelor's degree and master's from Sophia University in Tokyo, and a PhD from Graduate School of Political Science, University of Michigan. Previously, he was the director of Institute of East Asian Studies at Keio University, a visiting professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, and a visiting fellow at East-West Center, Honolulu. His specialty is international relations with East Asia, especially Sino-Japan relations and Japanese foreign policy. He is very famous for his book, Japan's Middle Power Diplomacy, translated to Korean more than a decade ago. Next to me, Professor Lee Kun. He is a professor of Graduate School of International Studies, Seoul National University. He is a graduate of Seoul National University and holds a master's degree and PhD from Wisconsin University. Currently, he is a co-president of the Institute for Future Strategy, 미래전략연구소. Not yet? Not now. I'm sorry. The president of the think tank 미래지, Future Wisdom, and the president of the Institute of Economic Research, Seoul National University. 경제연구소.
That is a different person.
Really? I'm sorry. Yeah. His research interest covers various topics, including international politics and international order, U.S.-Korea relations, inter-Korean relations, and so on. Next to Professor Lee Kun is Professor Nam Gi-jung. He is a professor of the Institute for Japanese Study at Seoul National University. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree in the Department of Diplomacy in Seoul National University. He got his PhD in Graduate School of Art and Science, Tokyo University. Previously, he was the professor in the Department of Law at Tohoku University and Department of International Affairs at Kookmin University. His expertise is in Japanese politics and foreign policy and international relations of East Asia. Today's topic is comparing Kishi and Abe, contradiction between alliance and autonomy. I'd like to ask the speaker to limit his presentation less than about 40 minutes. And then the discussant will speak for 10 minutes each. Afterward, we'll open the floor to everyone. This seminar is expected to run to 2:30, but after 2, if you have other engagement, please feel free to leave the room. Then Professor Soeya, let's begin your presentation.
Thank you for being here. I hope it would not turn out that you just came here for free lunch. I hope you would get something. At least the title should be interesting, and but the substance could also be interesting, I hope, as interesting as the title. And but I know that this is intellectually a challenge to present what I have in my mind. as a researcher in Japan, looking at Japanese developments. And it's a challenge because somewhat fundamental assumptions of many of my points could be different, particularly here in Korea. And of course, those differencing assumptions has its own, of course, backgrounds, which are not unimportant. But as far as looking into sort of details inside Japanese policies and policy-making, politics, somehow this difference, in terms of mostly perceptions, I think could be cleared in one way or another before Japan and South Korea can actually develop truly substantive and meaningful cooperation. And so I will take up that challenge and try to make sense as much as possible. But of course, I would like to enjoy and entertain questions, challenges during the discussion period, which could be a help for me in further trying to advance my interpretations. And so I will just follow the outline, and it was made out of slides, so basically the similar substance. And what I wrote as the first sentence in introduction, this is maybe the theme which runs through various cases, particularly comparison between Kishi and Abe. Let me just read this line. The use of the right of collective self-defense legalized by the 2015 security legislation by the Abe administration was almost like a deja vu of the previous cases of the expansion of Japanese security and defense policy within the post-war framework. And so basically changes within continuity. That's the kind of central sort of, that's how things evolved in changing Japanese security policies. And changes are perhaps important in themselves, but interpreting those changes as something fundamental or revolutionary, or things which might imply Japan, casting the post-war framework, or throwing away Japan's post-war framework. That point is terribly misleading from my point of view. And I know whenever, throughout the post-war period, in the evolution of Japanese defense and security policies particularly, whenever the sort of popular theme of Japan at crossroads, arose, people were sort of concerned whether Japan would actually get out of the post-war framework. And but in the previous years, this has not happened. And so my argument is, even under the current changes of the administration, it's basically the similar. But we are living today, so therefore we may be sort of tempted to say this time things could be different, right? And but this argument of this time Japan would be different, in fact, were often repeated throughout the process of changes. And in the recent history, when Japan dispatched its self-defense forces abroad for the first time in the 1990s to Cambodia as part of UNTAC, there were such arguments. Self-defense forces during the Cold War period have never been dispatched abroad, and this was the first time in the post-war history. So dispatching self-defense forces abroad was symbolic enough to for some people to say, oh, now Japan is different. Japan is moving in a different direction. But now nobody's talking about that. And I would think the similar thing would be repeated as to the security legislation of 2 years ago. and as a subject matter of Japanese actual security policies and behaviors. The problem I see in this process is more on the domestic side, the decision-making process and the quality of Japanese democracy. And so those things are a problem for us, but not necessarily toward outside countries because of changes in security policies. So this is my sort of concluding point. So I'd like to bring my talk there by starting the immediate period of soon after the end of the war. And it's like deja vu in that sense. And the first critical, development after the end of the war was the installment of the self-defense forces and the defense agency in 1954. I'll come to Article 9, which I think you should be very familiar, so I don't need to get into details about that. But Article 9, our post-war constitution, was virtually imposed by the American occupation force and came into effect in 1947. And after that, until 1954, Japan didn't have any military force. And that's in a way natural because the spirit of the Article 9 was indeed to demilitarize Japan. That was the concept. And the backgrounds were, of course, a series of Japanese wars and wars of aggression into Asia and Southeast Asia, and on the basis of colonized Korea, and then eventually led to the Pearl Harbor attack and war with the United States. And this extraordinary, history was, of course, a kind of natural thing which convinced many, and particularly Asians, but also Americans, that in the post-war order, Japan would be totally demilitarized, and the security of Japan was expected to be protected, guaranteed by the collective security system of the United Nations. But we all know that soon after that, the Cold War broke out in Europe, and eventually expanded into Asia. And the Korean War in 1950 was a sort of final blow to the process of post-war management of, Asian order. And so the logic of Article 9 initially was, of course, to totally dismantle Japanese military forces. But the outbreak of the Cold War meant that UN collective security system is not going to function. Then came a question how to protect Japan's security. So UN collective security system is not a kind of alternative to Japan's security anymore. So came the concept of alliance with the United States, security treaty with the United States. And so it was symbolic enough that Prime Minister Yoshida, after signing San Francisco Peace Treaty, on the same day, September the 8th of 1951, he moved a place and then signed security treaty with the United States. And so one important point, this is my central perspective to my arguments in the book introduced by Cho Yang-hyun, my Middle Power Diplomacy book. So that's the basic perspective and the framework of my analysis. That is, peace constitution is a result of the pre-Cold War period, when post-war order was conceptualized on the basis of the United Nations functioning, and China expected at that time as a Republic of China, not communist yet, and Korea was not, of course, divided, but at that time. And the allied concept of post-war management of Korea was international trusteeship, right? And so all these mechanisms or parts of post-war kind of expected order made totally demilitarize Japan as a kind of integral kind of piece. But all of those factors were gone soon after that, since 1947 into 1949 and 1950. So logically speaking, the logic of Article 9 lost its meaning in its implications for international order. So there came an argument to revise Article 9, and the US was the primary drive, pushing Japan to move in that direction. But Japan refused, Prime Minister Yoshida refused, and the public opinion largely was, of course, tired of the war, so they welcomed Article 9. They welcomed the US as a liberator of Japan. And so changing Article 9 was almost impossible, and Japan didn't volunteer to do that. So came US-Japan Alliance, Security Treaty. So here, Article 9 is a product of pre-Cold War, period. And the US-Japan Security Treaty is a product of the Cold War. And I think the sheer fact is both of these, chosen simultaneously by the Japanese leaders wouldn't have happened. Article 9 and the US-Japan Alliance, choosing these two at the same time under the same international environments wouldn't have happened. So this is a source of confusion, division, and of Japanese defense and security policy making, basically domestically. And the people on the left-hand side of this combination of two premises argued for protecting Article 9, and they were criticizing self-defense forces and the US-Japan Alliance. And those who are living under the reality of the Cold War, most of the policymakers, had to embrace the alliance, but they argued for changing Article 9. So depending on which side you stand, your attitude toward this combination of two premises are totally divergent. From the right, you attack Article 9. From the left, you protect Article 9 and attack alliance and self-defense force. So that's how the division of Japanese society was so serious in our domestic politics and debate about security making. And if I may jump to one of the concluding points, security policy making under the Abe administration also represent a similar thing. That is, initiation to install the new legislation 2 years ago divided our society and politics. So Prime Minister Abe's initiative is a source of division rather than unity. So that's in a way a kind of deja vu, or the continuation of the same sort of premise and the framework, very broadly speaking, very broadly speaking. So our argument for the revision of Article 9 became a natural argument after the break of the Cold War in Japanese domestic politics, but which until today has not been realized, and a tremendous continuity. And so initially, revising Article 9 and installing, military, that was a logical thing. So that's how many Japanese were arguing. Realists were arguing. But changing Article 9 was impossible, and in my view, still quite difficult, almost impossible. And so what they did was reinterpreting the Article 9 and established self-defense force and defense agency in '94. So as a result of this meant that Japan could have military without changing Article 9. So naturally what happened was argument for changing Article 9 subsided very sharply after that. And for incumbent governments, talking about Article 9 became almost a taboo through many years after that. And so this became a risky business for any politicians or the government to talk about Article 9. And so people in official positions, ministers and so forth, there were several cases where they sort of mistakenly, mentioned the necessity to change Article 9. If that sort of statement had come from, prominent politicians or people in official positions, without exception, this led to the resignation of that particular person. So the issue was so sensitive during much of the period, post-war period. And the second case of deja vu is this is where Prime Minister Kishi comes in. the revision of the US-Japan Security Treaty in 1960. And the motivation of the revision was clearly nationalism of one kind or another. Kind of looking for some kind of autonomy on the part of Japan. But the new security treaty, revised security treaty, is a current one. So this revised security treaty sort of consolidated and institutionalized the alliance setup more explicitly. And so if you may, Japan's dependence on the US in terms of Japanese defense and the external security became more institutionalized, consolidated, as a result of the revision of the security treaty, motivated by a sense of nationalism. And so this is what I say, the contradiction between alliance and autonomy. And my point as to the current, security legislation is basically the same. I will come to this later. This was motivated by Prime Minister's sort of personal sense of ambition, but the result was partial exercise of the right of collective self-defense, but he did it without changing Article 9 by reinterpreting Article 9. And also as a result, the US-Japan alliance was strengthened rather than weakened. So Article 9 maintained, the alliance strengthened. This is Article 9 alliance regime. That's the term that I use, and abbreviation would be A9A regime. And so that's a post-war regime, a framework premised on the Article 9 and the alliance. There is a basic contradiction between these two, but solving this contradiction has long turned out to be almost impossible, and Prime Minister Abe's attempts did not change it either. And so roughly speaking, that's what I mean by déjà vu. And so let me come to some details. I know this kind of argument would not be easy for some, maybe not people here, but for some Korean people, not necessarily intellectually, but maybe emotionally. I mean, the Japanese security policies changes, meaning not much. There is something wrong, I think, from Korean sort of common sense. And so intellectually, I mean, things could be debated, and I will present my thesis rather explicitly to sort of instigate discussions. And but let me try to sound sort of logical and rational from my own point of view in sort of developing that theme. And of course here I don't have to mention this here, but the right of collective self-defense, its legitimization comes from Article 51 of the UN Charter, right? So this is the kind of source of legitimacy. And so in short of UN collective security system functioning, Article 51 justifies the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. And so collective self-defense comes from here as an internationally legitimate right of any sovereign nation. But Japanese Constitution, Article 9, is like this. Perhaps I don't have to read this. And so the first clause talks about the Japanese renouncement of war or threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. And second paragraph says, in order to accomplish the aim of this paragraph, we don't have any military forces. And so point of interpretation is just to remind. So as means of settling international disputes, Japan is not going to have military forces. So if maintained strictly for self-defense purposes, this is not against the Article 9. So that's the logic of the government, which they announced at the time when self-defense force was established in 1954. So this was a government official announcement made by Hatoyama Ichiro government in December 1954, soon after the establishment of self-defense force. So self-defense is okay because this is not means of settling international disputes. So the Japanese logic since then was collective self-defense is beyond the self-defense defined by the Japanese government. So self-defense force for the purpose of defending Japan, in the strict sense of the term, that's allowed. But collective self-defense is beyond this margin. So that has been traditional interpretation by the Japanese government. And that's why the recent attempts by the government to partially recognize the right was so problematic. And many law specialists, constitutional experts, were very critical about this. And because interpretation of the Constitution, the traditional interpretation has been just as maintaining strictly self-defense-oriented forces is okay. But collective self-defense is not allowed. So collective defense in this form, of course, meant in the context of the U.S.-Japan alliance, U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So I'll come to that point later. So these are the basic sort of legal, basis of the United Nations Charter and Japanese Article 9 of Japanese Constitution. And the original U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, signed in September 8th of 1951, on the same day when Yoshida signed San Francisco Peace Treaty, Article 9 read as is written in your handouts. So again, I will not read it, but the problems, defects in this treaty as seen from Japanese policymakers were as follows. There was no terms of termination. So this treaty will continue forever. There was no specific term which talks about the termination of this treaty. And secondly, obligation on the part of the U.S. to defend Japan was very vague, because it said it is the, line 3 in your handout, Article 1 of the original treaty. It says, such forces may be utilized to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East and to the security of Japan. So this term may be used means may not be used. So it's up to the United States to decide. So there was no obligation explicitly mentioned. And number 3, this justifies American military intervention into Japanese domestic disturbances. So U.S. forces can be used to put down large-scale internal riots and disturbances. So these things, from the eyes of not only nationalists but from ordinary people too, but particularly for nationalist leaders, was sort of breach of Japanese sovereignty. And so rectifying these kind of breaches of Japanese sovereignty was the basic driving factor in the group of people like Prime Minister Kishi, who tried to change this, original security treaty. And what they really wanted is very much indicative, was very much implied by, just for example, a private plan of then Foreign Minister Shigemitsu. He's a former wartime leader, so he's clearly nationalist. And he had his own ideas, and he presented these to the American government in the process of trying to revise the original, U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And And the U.S., of course, wanted so-called equal, security relations with Japan. And equality was sort of symbolically indicated by the exercise of the collective self-defense, in fact. And Kishi's, John Foster Dulles' argument against the Japanese government at that time was, you cannot engage in collective self-defense with us, right? We may be able to help you, but you cannot help us. So that's the way how Washington pushed Japan, and Shigemitsu responded, okay, we'll try to do that. So in the Western Pacific, we're gonna exercise the right of collective self-defense. And Dallas asked how we are gonna do that with the current Article 9. And it's impossible. But Shigemitsu said, yeah, we'll see. So that's a sort of expression of wish in a way on the part of the Japanese government at that time. And the following two conditions are even more explicitly important. And Shigemitsu proposed that after the new security treaty comes in, revised, security revised, U.S. should withdraw ground troops within 6 years. And then U.S. should withdraw Navy and Air Forces within 6 years after the withdrawal of U.S. Army, so which means total withdrawal of American forces in 12 years. And in the meantime, U.S. forces in Japan would be used only for mutual defense. And Japan should abolish Japan's financial contribution to U.S. forces in Japan. I think these are clearly indicative of some sense of autonomy, right? Search of an autonomy. And here there is a contradiction. The other four, the bottom four items clearly indicates, interest in regaining Japanese autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. But collective self-defense with the United States is quite different. So these are not kind of strategically connected. Yeah, U.S. wanting collective security, so Japan will try. But at the same time, they are thinking of regaining some sort of autonomy. And but the end result was, of course, very different, the current treaty. And so this is what I mean by what motivates these policy changes and the policy outcome. Very different. The gap is still there. And this gap is a product of the A9A regime, Article 9 and U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. There is contradiction between the two, but this contradiction cannot be solved easily, so it remains. So politicians, policymakers, would have to function on the basis of these, contradictions. And so that's why and how our security policies may not be perceived in a very straightforward manner by outsiders. If you look at the one side, it may look as though Japan is motivated by nationalism, autonomy, and so forth. But the other half would say it's not happening. Japan is still, not performing, fully as a sovereign nation in the international stage vis-a-vis the U.S. or under UN security system. So this is a division of a sort of Japanese identity. So in my little book, I also introduced the concept of dual identity of Japan. These two totally different identities of Japan. And these two are both real in one sense or another. And but Japan, watch out, Japan is getting out, remilitarized. And on the other hand, Japan is doing nothing. What are you doing? You are still hiding behind Article 9. So those totally different arguments come toward Japan from right and left at the same time as to the same behavior. And the Japanese participation in the Cambodian peace process, the first time when we sent our forces abroad, was exactly the case like this. China, Korea said, forces are going abroad, watch out, And Lee Kuan Yew, Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore said, it's like giving chocolate alcohol to a recovering alcoholic, right? But international society, Europe, US, UN members are saying, what are you doing? Too little, too late, you know, and you just gave money after the Gulf War, at the time of Gulf War, and this is too slow, too late. And those two totally divergent views are given to the same behavior of Japan. And so this, my observation of this process led me to think of this term of dual identity of Japan. And Japanese domestic politics was also divided in the same way, you know, between right and left. And political and security and defense policies have always been factors of dividing our society and politics, and whenever these issues come out. So that's why, you know, things don't change so quickly and in a rational way. So continue to confuse outside observers. Depending on where you stand, your views towards Japan would be very different. And if I may compare, I have to finish in 5 minutes, right? And without coming to Abe, but that's okay. This is the basic framework. And I wrote, where was it? On page 3, yeah. So the revised security treaty has Article 5 and Article 6. Those are the core articles. And I write just below Article 6, prevailing conventional interpretation that Article 5 is about the defense of Japan and that Article 6 is about peace and security in the Far East is wrong. This is not how Article 5 and 6 should be read. And if you may go back to page 2, Article 5 says, each party recognizes that an armed attack against either party in the territories under the administration of Japan would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional provisions and processes. This is essentially about collective self-defense. You know, Japan, US, meeting the common danger together. But this, in the territories under the administration of Japan, this is what makes this clause unique. You know, it's basically saying collective self-defense only in the territories under the administration of Japan. This is because of Article 9. You know, only self-defense, Japan's defense. And the comparison with, you know, US-Korea Defense Treaty, Article 3, says each party recognizes that an armed attack in the Pacific area on neither party, you know. So this is, yeah, there is a specific phrase as to North Korea, you know, potentially division of North Korea, but the Article 3 of US-Korea Defense Treaty and Article 5 of US-Japan Security Treaty, the same. It's about the collective security. But in case of US-Korea in the Pacific area, you have to, you know, meet the common danger. But in case of US and Japan, only in the territories under the administration of Japan. So this is, you know, what we mean by, you know, Article 9 prohibits the use of collective self-defense beyond Japanese territories. And Article 6 on page 3, this is about presence of American military, you know, bases in Japan. And the purpose of American presence in Japan is for the security of Japan as well as maintenance of international peace and security. So Article 6 also talks about both Japan's security and international peace in the Far East. So this clause, I mean, US forces in Japan, of course, would be utilized or mobilized in case of Korean contingency. I mean, Korean contingency has long been the central, you know, thing for the US Army's, US forces in Japan to watch. And the Marines in Okinawa were being trained, anticipating Korean crisis. These years, of course, they are going to Middle East more often. But traditionally, Article 6 meant, Korean security and American presence in Japan. And so this is, Article 5 and 6. And so collective security system is indeed, collective self-defense logic was indeed this Article 6. So if I may quickly talk about new security legislation, and I will just skip detailed explanations of the whole structure, but the most important thing has to do with the right of collective self-defense, as many of you should be aware. And as a result of the new legislation, now 3 conditions for the use of force of self-defense. In the slides, this is a red part. Red part is the new addition. And the other parts are the traditional 3 conditions. When an armed attack against Japan occurs, that's number 1. And when there is no other appropriate means available to repel the attack. And number 3, use of force should be kept to the minimum extent. And as to the number 1 condition, the new aspect was placed. That is, on top of armed attack against Japan, when an armed attack against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan occurs, and as a result, threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to fundamentally overturn people's right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So this is about collective self-defense. And this important thing is this is not limited to the US anymore. Armed attack against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan occurs. If North Korea attacks South Korea, I'm pretty sure this clause applies to such an eventuality. But the second part is more important. And as a result, threatens Japan's survival. So this is because of Article 9. So the case of armed conflict against a foreign country, friendly country with Japan, but this has to have a direct impact upon Japan's survival. Then Prime Minister can order the deployment of self-defense forces. So that's how the new law, talks about. So it's a partial collective self-defense because in areas beyond Japan's survival is at stake. We are not going to do that still. But Korea has to do that in the Pacific if US is attacked. For instance, if Mexico attacks US, maybe according to this law, Japan will not be able to do anything because it's not going to be a direct threat. But if Mexico attacks the US, that's an attack against US in the Pacific. So legally, Korea has an obligation to do something, but Japan doesn't. So this is the kind of what I meant by partial exercise of the right of collective self-defense. And why this partial? Because they did it by reinterpreting Article 9. So previously they were saying self-defense is okay, but collective self-defense is out. But now they say national defense has two elements. One is self-defense, and the other is collective self-defense. So that's a new logic, the new cabinet decision, made. So collective self-defense is within the Article 9. So that's a new interpretation. So expansion of no interpretation, but the Article 9 was kept. So would this be the same as, the 1950s when Japan had military forces without changing Article 9, or fundamentally different? I think that is a big question, right? Because we are living under the current realities. 20 years later, we may have an answer. Yeah. So I think that's a real kind of question today. And as a Japanese, and I tend to argue, it's similar as a basic dynamism. And so which would mean changing Article 9, necessity has subsided. So Prime Minister Abe recently proposed a very interesting formula. just legitimizing the existence of self-defense force without touching the substance of its role. Because substance-wise, Prime Minister Abe has come this far. So no need to change Article 9, substance-wise. But still, changing constitution is his dream. So he is proposing a rather unsubstantial form of change. So changing itself as a goal in itself, rather than the substance of security and defense policy. So I'll stop there, and I'm very curious how Korean experts would respond to my interpretation. And I know it's psychologically not, how would you say? Maybe psychologically some of you may have been disturbed, but I like to continue this kind of debate with South Korea, because I really believe in the importance of Japan-South Korea cooperation. And there are potentials, and if this new law is applied, then Japan would be able to help South Korea in many ways in Korean contingency. We should be a big help, for South Korea, logically speaking. But another thing which I have to say is preparing for such a scenario on the part of our military self-defense force is not happening. So that's why I say this is Prime Minister Abe's agenda, rather than result of Japan's, deliberate considerations of defense security strategy. Yeah, so that's why this is a domestic agenda, rather than international agenda. That's why follow-up would not happen, naturally. Realizing this itself sort of achieved to some extent, Prime Minister Abe's wish. And so that's why, domestically this means a lot. And he did it somewhat in an undemocratic way of handling this process. So it's to me, this was a crisis in our democracy. And so that's the biggest problem for me, for us Japanese, I would argue. Rather than its negative impact on the external, environment, except in terms of perceptions, perhaps. And so I will finish here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Yoshide. To fully understand today's presentation, we need some understanding of Japanese defense policy in the post-war period. But to me, today's message is very clear. The two very famous rightist politicians in the post-war Japanese politics is Kishi and Abe. They tried to expand their autonomy. Kishi revised the treaty, and Abe legalized the use of right of collective self-defense in 2015. But ironically, however, the result of their efforts was to consolidate U.S.-Japan alliance, limiting the Japanese autonomy. So today's presentation raised many questions and implications, not only in Japan's foreign policy and defense policy, but also Japan's domestic politics, and also to the relation between Korea and Japan. Now we go to the designated discussion. So, Professor Lee, I know that you have to leave about 1 o'clock. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Because I have to leave around 1 o'clock, I was allowed to speak first. My name is Keun Lee, and I'm a professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. It is an honor to be a designated discussant to Professor Yoshihide Soeya, whom I respect very much. I will be very brief about my discussions on Professor Soeya's arguments. I think my interpretation of the gist of what he calls A9A regime is no first use. No first use is actually a concept that has been used in the nuclear strategy, but I imported this term to even to conventional strategy. My interpretation of A9 regime is that unless Japan is attacked first, or unless a country that is in close relationship with Japan is attacked first, Japan would not use any violence first. In other words, that is what has been called self-defense, and that also applies to the collective self-defense concept. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So my interpretation of all the changes and the changes of interpretations, even under Prime Minister Abe, has been done under the whole umbrella concept of no first use. And Professor Soya's point is that even Prime Minister Abe cannot change that particular norm of no first use because Japan is constrained by the A9A regime. And the farthest any right-wing politicians in Japan can go is only to strengthen Japan's military capability within A9N regime. That means Japan is not going to use its military forces or violence first, unless attacked first. Even though the situations may, enlarged, under which Japan may use its military forces. And my original understanding of Japan's current or recent foreign and military policies was that Japan is a revisionist country. That was my original understanding of Japan, because Japan wanted to regain Tokto, or Japan wanted to wants to regain Tokto. Japan wants to regain the northern islands, and Japan wants to change the status, or Japan wants to protect its sovereignty on Senkaku Island. These all look very revisionist. So I thought Japan was a revisionist country, but I changed my understanding of Japan after reading Professor Soya's articles and books. So my current understanding of Japan is that Japan is a revisionist country only in legal terms, but not in military terms. So militarily, Japan is not trying to change the status quo. Japan may be trying to change the status quo in legal terms. For example, in international courts, Japan is constrained by the so-called A9A regime, in changing the status quo. For example, if there is an international dispute on Tokto, unless South Korea does something, military, Japan is not going to use its military forces to change the status quo. The same is true with Senkaku Island. Unless China attacks first, Japan will not use its military forces. South China Sea, unless China attacks first, it'll be very difficult for Japan to do something with its military forces. So in terms of military areas, Japan is a status quo country. I don't know about Japan's legal and diplomatic attempts in changing the status quo, but at least in military terms, Japan is a status quo country. Then I have 3 questions with regard to the changed interpretations and new security legislations. The first question is, as written on my commentaries, the first question is, what if a foreign country that is in close relationship with Japan attacks first? For example, if South Korea attacks North Korea first, if the US attacks North Korea first in the name of preventive strike or preventive war, or in the name of preemptive strike or preemptive war. So that is what I termed as preventive war and preemptive war question. How would the Japanese politicians interpret this situation? And the second question is, what if some Southeast Asian countries try to settle the international disputes in South China Sea by military forces? In other words, I think that is quite related to the first question. What if a friendly country uses its military forces first? Then would Japan be involved in these international disputes? And this is a clear question of settling international disputes by military forces, and that is against the Constitution, Article 9. And the third question is, how can we prevent the so-called invited use of Japan's military forces as Japan did in Manchuria in 1931. You can manipulate a situation where Japan was attacked first, and then Japan was, had to use its military forces. But that is a manipulation, as it turned out. So can we prevent such a situation, even if Japan is constrained by the so-called A9A regime? So those are the questions that I have to Professor Soeya. The final part about what should Korea do, I think these are policy questions, so I try to avoid. I'm not going to touch upon those issues, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Even though in terms of military term, basically Japan is a status quo state, right? But you raised quite challenging questions to Professor Soeya's presentation. I think we had better to have a response of Professor Soeya before you leave. Yes.
Yeah, I've heard so many good things about Professor Igun, and the common point about all those praises is he's so creative and imaginative and raise points which not many other people will think about. And I think this was also, exactly similar nature. Yeah. And which means I haven't thought about this before, right? That's how Professor Igun's points are so innovative. And but as to my kind of clear response could be made as to the last question, sort of manipulation of the situation so that Japan would be able to come into this game without necessarily showing its kind of vicious intention. And this is what happened in the pre-war period, in several cases. And but I can hardly imagine. Not because Japan is not thinking, of manipulation. Japan is not thinking, but not because options are there and they are not thinking, but because options are not there to begin with. As I said, as a result of the legalization of this new aspect, there is no interest, there is no interest in actually, developing this legal basis into, security policies, and so we are stopping at that point. So we're far short of this possible scenario of sort of, manipulating the situation to use, this right. And so using this right under normal circumstances itself is not easy. And in reality, of course, if something breaks out in Korea, and I don't think Japan would invoke this law. It's impossible, right? And first of all, we are not preparing for that. And secondly, Japanese public opinion would be dominantly against it, no question. And of course, Koreans don't want it. And lastly, US does not want it necessarily. If our self-defense forces are, by the side of the United States, I think it would become more of a burden rather than military help under the current circumstances. And so whether Japan would eventually move in this direction, I'm not pretty sure. Again, this article, Article 5, this in the territories under the administration of Japan, logically speaking, this should be rewritten on the basis of the new legislation. Because now we have expanded the collective security, right? So it's not limited only to the territories under the administration of Japan anymore. It was expanded into other areas where attack against friendly country, Japan would fight, act to meet the common danger. And so, but there is no such argument at all by anybody I'm the only one who is making that argument. I wrote about this point in the Nikkei column some time ago, but no reaction at all. So to me, this is an indication that they are not seriously thinking about this as purely Japan's strategic, sense, as thing. So logically, this should be rewritten, right? And so my worry is if America find this out. I mentioned this point to Richard Armitage some time ago when we were sitting together in a conference. But his response was, no need. So even for Armitage, touching this is too risky. So that's a reality, So and the Japanese government cannot initiate this, I think. This would give rise to another series of domestic turmoil, disturbances among us. So nobody talks about it. But logically, this should happen, right? And even that is written, this area is far smaller than the case of Korea-US Defense Treaty, which is the Pacific, right? And I may be too logical, but that should be the logic. But things are not evolving according to that strategic logic necessarily. So these questions are interesting, but responding to these questions, there may be no necessity in terms of actual policy making, but intellectually, these are very, 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 very interesting and important perhaps. And I do not have an answer, but my sense would be in the initial phase of conflict initiated by foreign country that is in close relation with Japan, perhaps Japan may not act. But there may come a time when developments after that would involve, for instance, North Korean attacks against Japan. Then it becomes self-defense. Then the scene would change, for Japan to get involved. And but politically, the difficulty would be if U.S. does this, and if U.S. requests the Japanese government from the initial stage, then this may give rise to some difficult issue, perhaps. But again, this scenario, nobody is preparing for that, even the Americans and Japanese. So these questions may become real questions if actually Japanese security policies evolve in the direction of this legal logic, to be sort of realized as actual, our security options. Then this question might become important. But under the current circumstances, we still remain far short of this. So I appreciate the first point about what Korea should do. No need to panic. You don't have to worry, Koreans.
It's fine.
Thank you for having me as a designated discussant, and I'm very happy to meet Professor Soya again for the first time in around 1 year, and to have opportunities to share ideas. Thank you for your insightful presentation, and I learned very much from your presentation, and it was very interesting for me because I wrote an article a year ago from very similar perspective to yours. The title of the article is From Self-Defense Forces to Army, and the subtitle is Dialectic of Dream of Independence and the Reality of Alliance. It was published in the volume of the Korea Journal of Japanese Studies last year. So as you guess from the subtitle, the interest and the goal of the article are very similar to those of Professor Soya. And hereafter, I would like to summarize my arguments as some comments on today's presentation and raise some questions to share. In order to anticipate the changes in Japan, it is necessary to confirm the exact position of Abe's security defense policy in the growing tendency of conservative swing, Hoshuka, and rightward trend, Ukeika, of Japanese politics. To do this, it is necessary to rearrange the following points. First, to differentiate the trend of conservative swing and rightward movement. Second, to confirm how security defense policy developed in post-war Japanese history. Third, to confirm security discourse surrounding Abe's security defense policy. Fourth, to confirm the environmental factors surrounding Abe cabinet. This confirms the following facts. First, the proposal of autonomy or independence in defense policy inevitably leads to debate about the consistency with the US-Japan alliance, and rather it tends to strengthen the US-Japan alliance. Second, Japan's defense policy has often developed between the ideal of autonomy and the reality of the alliance. And the reality of the US-Japan alliance has often suppressed the ideal or dream of autonomy, as you mentioned in your presentation. Third, the main front of the security debate in Japan is formed between institutional liberals and political realists, not between political realists and traditional right-wing statists. Fourth, the public opinion of the Japanese people showing a negative attitude toward the amendment, which includes the formation of the national army, the changes in the demographic structure of Japan, and the deterioration of the financial situation are the three major constraints on Abe's security defense policy. Today in Japan, the arguments on the amendment of the constitution and on the establishment of national army represents the rightward trend. But this kind of reality can be recognized as a phenomenon where conservatives swing in the foreign and security policy, which attach greater importance to the reality of international politics than to the ideal of peace, is deflected by the logics of the rightward trend of civil societies, where the ideal of community is requested rather than the reality of society. At present, Prime Minister Abe is facing a political crisis due to the drop in his approval rating. Abe's political crisis is also a crisis of the right-wing group who wants to revise the constitution. In this reality, the following questions can be raised, and I would like to discuss with Professor Soeya. First, what are the prospects for the constitutional revisionist group in post-Abe politics? Second, do you think that the concept of East Asian regionalism can revive again instead of the constitutional revisionism? Third, do you think that the normalization of state, 후츠국가가, without the revision of constitution is possible? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nam. Professor Nam's perspective on the Japanese security policy is basically the same of Professor Soeya's. Nam raised some quite specific questions related to the constitution revision. Professor Soeya, please answer to Professor Nam's questions.
Thank you again for excellent questions and summary of my arguments. Well, I will respond to the three questions raised at the bottom, and maybe in this order. Well, aside from a sort of definition of constitutional revisionist, we just perhaps share just the same kind of image. So without getting into details, let me respond on that basis. And my sense is this will once again be pushed to the marginal corner of our society and politics. And existence of these groups and views, it's no secret that, in Japanese society and politics, these views have existed all the time, since the end of the war. but through much of the post-war period, they were on the margin. They were marginalized. But of course, even though they are on the margin, they was one of the factors, important factors complicating the decision-making of Japanese defense foreign policy and also affecting external perception of Japan. So they were not insignificant, even though they were on the margin. But what's happening today is, when I talk about our Prime Minister, I often say there are two Mr. Abe. One is Mr. Abe as an individual, and Mr. Abe as a Prime Minister. And they are not exactly the same, in terms of their behaviors and and outcome. So Mr. Abe as an individual, I think is one of the people belonging to this, this group that you have raised, talked about, and who used to be on the margin, but they have voices, and but now he is at the center of the power structure. So as a result, these sort of the people group who used to be on the margin were somewhat drawn towards the center because of this, central force. And so that creates certain kind of air, in Japanese kuki, in which dealing with these elements in our domestic context has become very complex and very sensitive, thing. And even I'm trying to select my words because this is being taped, and so future of these elements would be, if Prime Minister Abe leaves the stage, I think once again this would gradually be marginalized. I cannot think of second Mr. Abe. He's very special in many ways. I cannot think of any similar leader. He's of course blood is perhaps important, but he has a very strong conviction that what made Japan somewhat wrong was because of reforms during the occupation. And this is an ideological thing rather than a kind of assessment of objective things necessarily. And two important, instruments installed during the occupation were first constitution and secondly educational system. So reforms of education and the constitutional reform are the two primary, somewhat ideological agenda of Prime Minister Abe, which means not necessarily driven by any sense of future-oriented strategy. These are defined by his views toward the post-war process originating in the occupation reforms. And in this belief, he's in a way, in the extent to which he strongly believes in this, he's in a way unique. Generally there are people who would share the same kind of feelings, so who of course are sympathetic with Prime Minister Abe. But this is not prevalent among the general public. And so if he leaves the power center, I think this will gradually be shifting to the previous sort of, situation, and which will be, they will continue to be important, but they will once again be on the margin of society. But which does not mean that they are not important, of course. They will continue to complicate, decision-making process, particularly defense, security, and constitutional issues. And but how to assess their power is another thing. And they are important in a domestic context. But as a result of their voices remaining there and becoming important, what's happening is confusion in our domestic situation, rather than any clarity. And the more bigger voices they have, our politics will become more complex and confused, which would mean that coming to any coherent, rational strategy would be more difficult if their influence is bigger. I think that's actually what's happening today, and this thing may continue to be the case in Japanese domestic politics. So that's what I wanted to mean in a way when I said Prime Minister Abe's initiatives are maybe sources of division and confusion of our domestic politics rather than source of unity. And as to the second, I think the choice is not between East Asian regionalism and constitutional, change. Some are related, but the more critical division would be in terms of East Asian regionalism, how you define China factor in this regional approach. I think that's the divisive sort of element. And in the promotion of East Asian regional cooperation, if you conceptualize this as a China strategy in the way of checking, expansion of Chinese influence, that's one thing. And another is what former Prime Minister Koizumi initiated, is, of course, China is an important factor. And we have to think about China jointly, but not necessarily as a kind of counteraction against Chinese increasing influence, but eventually to accommodate, Chinese influence. And in order to accommodate Chinese influence, of course, you have to cooperate. Any single country cannot do that, single-handedly. So regional cooperation is so critical in coping with the growing influence of China. So the end goal of this second scenario would be coexistence with China. We have to coexist in one way or another. And we have to think of regional system in that direction. And in order to do that, East Asian countries should be able to cooperate. And in my argument, Japan should be a critical, important player in this context of East Asian regionalism. But if you are preoccupied with the China threat, then you tend to incline toward the first conceptualization of regional cooperation. I argue in Japan it's not going to work because no other East Asian country is interested in doing this, ganging up against China, right? And of course Japan cannot do that alone. Therefore, the importance of the alliance tend to be that's the last sort of option, if you just think of China in this way. So that may be what's happening now. And so that's why East Asian regionalism is not very much, being promoted, by the current government. At least we don't have that impression. And so I think that's the division. And I think for Japan to come to the second, realize the importance of the second conceptualization of East Asian regionalism is terribly important. Of course, first of all, in dealing with China, but secondly, in developing cooperation with East Asian countries, including Korea and Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asian countries too, they are not interested in, balancing against China. They know they cannot do that, right? And South Korea also knows you cannot do that. And in my view, Japan should know also that we cannot do that, so that's my response to the second question. And thirdly, so this is what do you mean by normalization? And you may or may not know, President Nam should know this. In my argument of Japan's middle power strategy, I'm also arguing for the revision of Article 9. And in that book, I encouraged Japanese liberals to come up with their own proposal. Then this should be very different from the proposal coming from the current, LDP. And by this I mean revision of Article 9 should be premised on a sense of strategy toward the future, rather than your sense of trauma about the past. And so my revision formula is along the line with Japan's future-oriented middle power strategy, and whose philosophy is, of course, liberal internationalism. And cooperation with other countries is very important. And only by doing that, I think this argument will be received by, East Asian countries as something positive, rather than negative. Then, area of Japanese participation of international peacekeeping and even human security, would expand. So Article 9 is a liability in this sense too. And this kind of awareness, in fact, arose in the first part of the 1990s, when Japan failed in responding to the first Gulf War, and we ended up paying, $13 billion, $100 per person, including babies. But we are still being criticized, checkbook diplomacy and not doing anything. And then came Cambodian, participation in Cambodia peace. So during those years, support for the revision of Article 9 has increased dramatically in the public opinion polls. In the 1980s, it was like 20-some%. But in the middle of 1990s, about more than 50%, close to 50%, 50 point something, said Article 9 needs to be revised. But the reasons they chose, were more important. And number one reason was Article 9 is a liability in international contribution. So this is a sort of internationalist, sense of, revising Article 9. And the Japanese public opinion naturally responded in that way. So that's how changing Article 9 has become a sort of natural thing. I mean, ceased to be a taboo in the Japanese society in the 1990s because of these internationalist developments. And it's not a coincidence that during the 90s, I think Japan has reasonably dealt with the so-called history problem, seriously. Starting with Kono's statement about comfort women and the Asian Women's Fund, and the Murayama statement, and Kim Dae-jung-Obuchi reconciliation in 1998. These were possible because of the accumulation of these Japanese sincere efforts to deal with history problems, with South Korea included, of course. And South Korean government at that time appreciated Japanese, responses. And so I think support for Article 9, changing Article 9 from internationalist philosophy, and Japan trying to deal with history problems. I mean, these were not coincidences, I think. That's how Japanese policies started to change in the 1990s. But I argue in my most recent book called Anzen Hoshou Toinaos, Reconsidering Security. In fact, Korean translation of that book is now complete. And I'm now trying to find a publisher here. But anyway, there I argued that healthy evolution of Japanese debates and policies in the 1990s was hijacked by nationalists, throughout the second half of the 1990s because of increasing threat perception of North Korea and China. And so changing Article 9 started from this internationalist context. But nationalists somehow hijacked this, into their own. And so I sort of, in one chapter, I traced that, shifting process, And the so-called value-based diplomacy also became our, government, slogan. And the value used to be talked about in the way of redefining the importance of the US-Japan alliance. After the end of the Cold War, Soviet threat is gone. So for a short period of time, Japanese are beginning to argue no use of alliance anymore, right? So policymakers, bureaucrats had to think of alternative logic. But China threat was not an alternative logic yet, at that time. So came values, importance of values. This is a globalist argument, to define alliance from the point of universal values. But nationalists hijacked this concept and began to talk about freedom of arc of freedom and prosperity. Freedom and prosperity, fine, but why arc, right? So this is somebody said, I think this is Bill Emmott, he said once in a conference, this is a geopolitical use of values, and so this is again similar. I mean, the liberal arguments for the revision hijacked by nationalists, and sort of this universal definition of the importance of values, somewhat hijacked by anti-China people. So that's arc of freedom and prosperity in my interpretation. And so we have to reverse this trend in one way or another into the future. So that's how 1990s is critically important to reflect upon. And I'm making this argument in the context of comfort movement today. Yeah, you have to look at what we did, in the 90s, and reflect upon them and talk about what they did today. And if there are still defects, let's continue to deal with it. So flatly rejecting what happened at one time is too risky, and it's a lot of loss. We have very good productive history in the 90s. And normalizing state, to me, is normalizing as a sort of full-fledged middle power. That's what I argued in my English article published in 2012. I mean, a normal country is toward a normal middle power. And so in order to do that, Article 9 needs to be changed. So that's my context of normalization and the revision of Article 9. And I would think this makes sense, right? But in a very complex domestic context in which many were pretty much affected by the rising influence of China or North Korea or domestic problems, we are not able to engage in these seriously important real strategic debates necessarily. There are many factors which intervene into these otherwise what should be rational logical argument. So confusion in domestic context, I think that's our biggest problem. One of my concluding points about this new security legislation as well.